Hey, before we start, you should know that this video is more of a complimentary video to my one on Bloodlines 2. If you haven't already, then I recommend you go and watch that one first so you can get my full opinions on the base game, since the only things I'll mention here are the combat updates, the 2 story DLCs, and a bit of context for the story I didn't mention in my previous video because I wanted to keep that as spoiler-free as I could. This one, however, is going to be a lot more spoiler-heavy, but that's because the DLCs are a lot more narrative-focused. Anyway, let's get right into it. Since the release of Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, there have been a few updates alongside 2 DLC releases. Now when it comes to a DLC release, there comes an opportunity to include new items, new story beats, maybe a rework of some skill trees or abilities, and maybe just an expansion on the game in general. And the 2 DLCs that we have here give us some of those things, but both DLCs have more of a narrative focus to them, following the stories of 2 characters we had seen in the base game, and expands more on their characterization and what they've been up to as Fire's just been messing around Seattle. And alongside each DLC release is an update to the base game that they've called the Spring and the Summer Update, which features some quality of life updates alongside a few combat changes. And before we get into talking about the DLCs more in depth, let's talk a bit more about the updates and if it's an improvement to the base game. The main update to the game comes in the form of the rework to combat, and when I say rework, I mean that they now allow you to use melee weapons and firearms. Finally, Fire can now probably pick up a gun with their hands and fire the various reskins of enemies instead of using their telekinesis to blow their load. I already did this joke before. The weapons are fine, the firearms are fine. I wish I had more to say about this because I was kinda hoping for more of an actual rework to combat, but for the most part it just stayed the same. While it is good to finally be able to use weapons and firearms, something that I wish was there from the beginning, I was kind of expecting more from this, and that's just my fault. Something like having a proper weapons inventory where you can change what weapon you have equipped, maybe even an implementation of combat skills like brawl, melee, and firearms like in Bloodlines 1. I did notice that using a weapon such as a hammer is extremely busted because of how much damage it deals, so I ended up relying on that more than a few times. Melee weapons also end up breaking when you use a heavy attack, but I also can't tell if there's a durability system where the weapon would break after prolonged use, but when it comes to firearms, you have a limited amount of ammo that you can already use in the weapon, and when you use up all the ammo, you just toss away the weapon. And like with anything combat related in this game, it feels clunky at the beginning, and it takes a while to get used to, especially with how quick combat is. I found myself getting the shit kicked out of me as I run around trying to find a weapon or a firearm to use in fights, and when you run into more and more enemies using different weapons later on in the game, you're gonna have an arena that's just littered with bats, knives, and pistols. The average rural American suburbs, really. So it becomes a bit hectic looking for a weapon to use, but there's a few things that they've added to help slow the pace of combat a bit, and one of them is when you press the button to aim to use one of your abilities, the game now slows down so you can easily target an enemy from melee attacks. Now this one I haven't used as much, especially since there's this Beno Hakim power that you can get, which slows down time so you can just easily beat up enemies. Really, you're just moving faster than them. And the other change that they added is that you're now able to block in combat, but not in the way you might think. It's not tied to any button or anything. Rather, it automatically happens when you don't do anything offensive in combat and are looking at the person attacking you. Feels useless in groups since you can only block in front of you, but I really just wish it was tied to some timed block mechanic to make parries easier. I don't know if this really changes combat, or at least changes how I played the game though, and I'm sure for some people it's a welcome addition and I'm happy for them, but I guess I was just disappointed because I was hoping for more, which is kind of funny because people were probably disappointed with Bloodlines 2 because they were expecting more from it. Funny how that works out. Looks like karma's come back to fuck me. The last thing I should talk about are the changes to categorizing some of the main quests to becoming side quests, and this just feels more like the devs are saying, what are we gonna do? We got boring side quests and we need to change something. And honestly, I feel like this is something they should have just gritted their teeth and accepted what they had, because I feel like the only way to make exciting side quests is to write exciting side quests. And some of the quests they changed feel like they were just there to give you more information on what's going on in the story. Such as one quest where Katsumi is asking you to prevent Masquerade breaches by some anarch groups, which shows you that all the anarchs in Seattle aren't unified under her, or a quest from Sophia to rescue her ghouls, which does end up hinting at her being more duplicitous. And like I said, this feels like a change they've done because they recognize their side quests aren't that exciting and that they had no proper fix for it except for this. Anyway, that's all I got on the base game changes. Let's talk about the DLCs. The 2 DLCs we'll be looking at are called Loose Cannon and The Flower and the Flame, and they'll follow the stories of 2 kindred we meet in the base game, Benny Muldoon and Isabella Moore, 2 antagonists towards Fire, and I expect that these stories will be more about how they've come to join the Sabbat. Now, I've talked talked about Benny in my last video, but I've not once mentioned Isabella at all, and I've also not mentioned the Sabbat either, so I'm going to explain a bit why and give a bit of context starting with the Sabbat. If you're familiar with the role of the Sabbat in Vampire the Masquerade in general, then you'd know that they reject the traditions set by the Camarilla, they don't respect the Masquerade, kind of. Well, they do because it's useful, but it's not really seen as a tradition to them. But they're also more overt than the Camarilla about being kindred. They're usually seen as the evil vampires, evil being in quotes because who really are the good vampires here, and are in general out there to wage war against the antediluvians. Now, the Sabbat in Bloodlines 2 are sort of different, at least in their motivation. As you progress through the game, you'll learn that the Sabbat are in Seattle, and Fire sees this as a major threat. As you continue to investigate the Sabbat, you learn about the gardener, the one who's been inducing these dreams for Fabian and Fire, where they get to revisit Fabian's past memories. And you find out that the gardener is Gideon Hall, who is Fabian's sire. Gideon seems really intent on Fire diablerizing him, and this sounds insane, and it might be because he's a Malkavian, or Sabbat philosophy has just caused him to go down this path. Or maybe a combination of two, but keep that part in mind. As you progress further into the game, you get the reveal that was foreshadowed throughout that Sophia herself is part of the Sabbat conspiracy, and that she was the one who has branded Fire with the marks on their body. Now, why Gideon and Sophia would become Sabbat are shown throughout Fabian's memories of the 1920s. While investigating the rebar killer, you find out who the murderer was, and spoilers, it's Lou Graham and JJ Campbell, who at the time was her ghoul. And at some point, Gideon has figured this out as well, and went to go confront Lou about it, which resulted in Lou imprisoning him beneath the streets of Seattle, where he stayed until he came in contact with Fire in the story. You'd also be able to infer from Fabian's memories that Sophia and Gideon are close, like romantically close to one another, and Gideon's disappearance has really affected her to the point that she left Seattle for 100 years, only to return and hatch a plan to brand the Nomad with a mark so that when they wake up after 100 years of torpor, they diablerize Gideon, who they would hope would then take over the Nomad's body. She'd be reunited with her lover, and together they would destroy the Seattle Camarilla, and at some points they recruited 2 members of the Camarilla to join them, Benny and Isabella. Now, like I said, Benny I've talked about. Camarilla sheriff that began massacring Thin Bloods, and Fire put a stop to him on the orders of the Camarilla, but Isabella plays less of a role in the base game to the point that she was just there to reveal the Sabbat's activities in Seattle. She first meets Fire after you're done talking with Lou Graham, and tells Fire to visit her at her nightclub at some point, but because of the way the game was designed, you don't get to visit her until you hear that some shit goes down at the nightclub, and you learn that Isabella is a poser of a Toreador because of her tacky arts. And also that she's a Sabbat, but I'm gonna be honest, I think her art just kinda sucks. It just looks really tacky. I mean, what the hell is this? Like, why are the Sabbats so edgy, dude? What the fuck? It's really unfortunate that she had such a small part in the story, and we don't get to speak much to her, but hopefully when we get to her DLC, we'll be able to learn much more about her and why she joined the Sabbat. But first, Loose Cannon follows Benny Muldoon and what he's been doing ever since he ran into Fire at the start of the game. It starts off with him in his office listening to a recording from a person we just know as the Mouth, and we can just assume it's Sophia at this point, who tells him that his massacre of the Thin Bloods is happening way too soon, and that he should wait until the Sabbat gives him the signal to finally do something, which is probably to do what he's been doing now, but with approval, I guess. Benny's gotten frustrated with the Sabbat doing pretty much nothing towards the Anarchs and the Thin Bloods, and so he decided it's best to take matters into his own hands and have a few words with the leader of the Seattle Sabbats. The DLC gives you 3 quests to complete. 2 of them feel more like side quests in that they aren't too long and could be done really quickly, but calling them side quests is a bit misleading since you do have to finish them to continue with the story. One of them has you follow a courier for Katsumi, who we get to see is actually Damsel, and another quest that feels more involved is where you get to see Benny turn in his badge and position as sheriff to the Camarilla, and it gives you this flashback of his interaction with JJ Campbell. The third mission you can do has you heading into the underground tunnels of Seattle to confront the gardener, who is called Mr. Sunshine in this for some reason, and to vocally express your frustrations to the Sabbat, which have just not been doing anything for like, what, 10 years since Benny joined them, apparently? You can do these 3 missions in any order, but it does feel like there's a set order to them, kind of to make things more coherent. It does seem intended for you to go and speak with Mr. Sunshine first, since going there triggers a flashback of how Benny got in contact with the Sabbats. In 2014, Benny was working for the Camarilla and was sent to the underground portion portions of Seattle to prevent a Masquerade violation by the Sabbats. While there, he begins to hear the voice of Mr. Sunshine. I'm just gonna call him the gardener from now on. He begins to hear the voice of the gardener speak to him, and he shows him these visions of people that Benny knows, talking about how disposable they see him or how disappointed they are in him. Most of these are lines we get to see in the main story, such as when Fire was talking with Tully about how Benny fucked things up by waging war on the Anarchs, or how Max, who is Benny's sire, is telling Fire that Benny needs to be stopped. We also get to see Lou Graham scolding Benny over something he's done, as well as Fabian commenting about it. Now, these visions are clearly meant to shake Benny's resolve and his opinion of the Camarilla as the gardener tries to tempt him to defect towards the Sabbat, and that comes to a culmination when he enters the main hall where a statue of the gardener is found. And after a fight against somebody named Mr. Knight, okay, sure. Benny comes face to face, sort of, with the gardener, who shows him a vision of what could happen if Katsumi and the Thin Bloods are left alone. It talks about how Katsumi plans to integrate the Thin Bloods into the Camarilla court in Seattle, which could lead to a civil war amongst the kindreds that ends up with the IAO purging the city of vampires. This vision of a possible future is enough to get Benny to side with the Sabbat, acting as a double agent within the Camarilla, waiting for the right time to massacre the Thin Bloods in his attempt to prevent the IAO from destroying the kindred of Seattle. After the flashback is over, Benny returns to the main chamber where he destroys the statue of the gardener, only to find out who he really is, which is a decaying vampire and not some all-powerful kindred as he was expecting, and this causes him to leave the Sabbats. After completing all 3 missions, you begin the mission where Benny makes his way to the construction area where all the Anarchs and Thin Bloods are, and he begins his killing spree, which ends with him being staked in the heart by Damsel and placed into a slab of concrete where he stays until he's found by Fire. The DLC wasn't too long, it was only about 3-ish hours in length, and it was surprising how short it felt because I was kind of expecting a bit of a longer story where we got to see more of Benny and his time with the court in general. Instead, what we got was more of a fill-in-the-blank story to find out just a bit more about Benny and how he got to the place where he was at the start of the game, and I'd be fine with this if it just fleshed him out a bit more as a character. We did get some moments that showcase a bit of Benny apart from being Mr. Kill the Thin Bloods, and we did start to see some of that motivation behind his intense desire to massacre a whole generation of kindred. It seems clear that in some cases, Benny does care about Seattle and about his sire, given how 2 of the dialogue options he gets after being shown this possible future by the gardener is about saving Seattle or saving Max, with only one option asking if there's a way to escape this. This also pairs well with what we can learn about Benny in the base game story, since we know he still visits Max from time to time, and in a way, this kind of humanizes Benny and it shows us the kind of person he is. It also shows that he's more than just his Bruja blood, where he even considers telling Campbell about this rather than deciding to rebel immediately. And if we got this level of depth with each of the other missions we get to do, I think it would have been far more interesting and far more engaging. Take for example the quest where Benny turns in his resignation from the Camarilla. We get a flashback of him with Campbell as they talk about the previous sheriff and how Benny became sheriff in 2020. What I would have liked to have seen are more scenes with Benny and Campbell discussing what they view as the real threat in Seattle, since it's clear that Benny has it in his head that Katsumi and the Thin Bloods are the problem, but what we know from the base game that Campbell and Katsumi have been working together despite Katsumi being removed from the Camarilla. And it would have been nice to see this back and forth between the 2 of them, especially since there's like 2 lines that sort of stuck out to me. One is when Campbell mentions how Katsumi has done enough damage, and whether this is implying that this is when Katsumi was cooperating with the Thin Bloods while still on the Camarilla, or if this is about her role as an Anarch leader, which is kind of unclear on when that happened. After the flashback cutscene, Benny tells Sophia that Campbell was the one holding him back from dealing with Katsumi after her expulsion from the Camarilla, and it would have been nice to have gotten more screen time between the 2 of them so we can both learn more about Campbell and his time as Prince, his dealings with Katsumi, and how it was viewed by the courts, and also to see how Benny has more or less cemented himself within the Sabbat. Wait, fuck. We could have also seen multiple scenes of Campbell dismissing Benny over and over again to really show how Benny felt about the Camarilla over time, especially when Benny felt so strongly about saving Seattle against the Thin Bloods and the Anarchs. But instead, what this cutscene is telling us is that Benny has been apparently loyal to the Sabbat for about 6 years, and the only reason he wasn't found out is because of a ring given to him by the gardener. Now, what I am gonna say next, which you have to keep in mind, is that I am somebody who liked the story story of Bloodlines 2, and I like to think that that carries some weight when I say that the story of loose cannon is just fine, but it's not fine in a good way. It's fine in that it is a story and it gives us some more information, but none of it really properly goes into exploring Benny. What we got to know is how he got embroiled with the Sabbat, and we got to know that he's not too fond of Campbell, and we got to know why he wants to kill the Thin Bloods. It felt more like a small expansion of notes made to explain why he does what he does, and not so much learning more about the kind of vampire he is. On top of that, a lot of this is just surface level information. Why did he join the Sabbat? Gold Statue told him bad things are coming. Why did he leave the Sabbat? They weren't doing anything. Also, Gold Statue is just a regular vampire. Why is he doing what he's doing? Thinks he'll save the city. It doesn't really go into any depth or detail, and I think that's such a missed opportunity and really upsetting. Also, it's only 3 hours long. Anyway. I went into this DLC expecting it to be similar to Loose Cannon, where we get to learn about how Isabella came in contact with the Sabbat and how she ended up with a nightclub that violates basic health and safety laws. What I got in return, however, was an interesting look into a character who barely got any screen time or development in the base game, finding out about who she is as an artist and as a vampire, and also how she ended up with a nightclub that violates basic health and safety laws, which has been a nice change. We don't actually get as much on why Isabella joins or becomes part of the Seattle Sabbat, but we see that she received an invitation to head to the conservatory by Sophia, who shows her the body of the Nomad as she invites her to her conspiracy to destroy the Seattle Camarilla, and Isabella ends up joining her. In fact, her reasoning to join her seems to be more abstract in a way, such as this looks like it'll be interesting, so I want to see where it goes kind of thing, even though when Fire speaks to her before her boss fight, she says she wants to end the Masquerade. Sophia touches upon Isabella not liking boundaries, but this barely comes up when Isabella joins the Sabbat. But like Benny, Isabella also grew tired of the Sabbat's inactivity over the years, and she decided to create her own masterpiece of performance art regarding her nightclub. In a way, it feels like they've learned a few lessons from the Loose Cannon DLC regarding the Flower and the Flame. In particular, you can go through these missions in any order and it'll still make sense. Some of it will have you recruit Sabbat leaders to help you with your event, you'll be inviting guests to the event to go to Atrium, and you'll also be gathering Moonflower blood to, I guess it's more like drugging the guests to the nightclub. The biggest part of Isabella's story comes around the last hour or so of the DLC, where she goes on this introspective journey to reflect on her past, her doubts, her anxieties, and just who she is as a person and a Toreador. I will admit, on an initial pass of the story, it felt a bit difficult for me to follow, especially when we get to like these sections where you're given like 3 options of what could have happened in Isabella's past. Whether she's stuck by her persona as an artist, or a person who is able to take advantage of others and make her own way to the top, or giving in to her more bestial vampiric instinct. The issue I had is that I went into this expecting to learn more about Isabella and who she was. I was waiting to be told about her character, but instead what I got, paired with multiple options to reserve earlier dialogue choices, was more of a role-playing option where I got to pick how I viewed the character and how they'd be developed. And there's even 3 achievements to get for the DLC, which is based on the choices you made throughout. Jesus Christ, it means I gotta play this 3 times for all achievements. Whether you decide to give in to the beast at each opportunity, or to manipulate others using your Toreador presence, or even leaning more in the art diva and caring more about the craft, you can shape Isabella's personality throughout the story, which is something I've begun to notice just way too late into the DLC. Thankfully, at some point in the game, we get told by this version of Sophia that's in Isabella's blood because of the bond she formed when she joined the Sabbat. The irony, however, is that based on her actions and dialogue, Isabella is a manipulative and awful person, doing what she wants to get what she wants, whether it's the moments where she's charming Willem so that she can drink from his blood, or manipulating Sophia's ghoul so she could find the location of the Sabbat leaders, or even taking away crowds from both the Glacier Hotel and the Dutchman. So the option of her backstories that makes her more of a diva and caring about the art, painting her in a much better light, doesn't seem like it would be accurate to her, but this could also be based on some of the choices that I made going through the game. That being said, it would have been nice to see something similar to this in the base game, which can be tied to some like humanity stat for Fire, whether they manage to maintain their humanity as a vampire, or if they give in more to the beast. This would have been great to have because this does end up feeling more like a role-playing game, similar to what Bloodlines had. Overall, I feel like this DLC has been better than the Loose Cannon one, though it's not that high of a bar. It feels like they've looked back on what they made previously and tried to improve on them, but there's still a few issues I have when it comes to this DLC. Some are similar to my problems with Loose Cannon, but just in a different flavor. I still think it's too short, which is also about like 3-ish hours in length, and when it tries to go more in depth about who Isabella is, it ends up sacrificing more on why she's doing the things she does. I mentioned before that Isabella told Fire that she's doing this to end the Masquerade, supposedly so that her art can break into mortal life without any restrictions. But I had to remind myself about this because I had to go look back at my old footage from the base game, which Isabella was in. I do appreciate going more into Isabella's backstory, but I wish it wasn't done through this introspection trip that's been induced by drinking from Willem from the blood he got from the gardener. I feel what also stopped me from really getting into this DLC as opposed to the loose cannon one, at least on what I have to say, goes back to what Isabella's role was in the base game. Despite the fact that Fire only got to see them twice in the story, we got more information about Benny than we ever did about Isabella, but that just ends up being an issue with the base game's storytelling. I should point out that before La Sombra and Toreador became available in the base game, they were meant to be tied to these DLCs, with La Sombra tied to Loose Cannon and Toreador tied to Fire and Flame. So maybe the main intention for these two story DLCs was more so to sell people the new playable clans, but of course that practice is fucking garbage, so they walked back on that decision, which ends up making these two DLCs feel more hollow in the end. Hey, so I've been editing this part and I just want to point out that I am just wrong here. I could have sworn that the clans were meant to be tied to the DLC stories, but I couldn't find any proof of that. La Sombra and Toreador were meant to be paid DLC clans before release, but I think what made me misremember this was that they walked back the decision on the paid DLC clans and then revealed the two story DLCs afterwards. It doesn't make it any better. I will say that there was something I liked about these DLCs, and it's that both Benny and Isabella played differently from Fire. It was nice to not just have them be the same character but in different coats of paint. While playing Isabella, I had very little reason to actually travel around the rooftops. She didn't have an easy way to get from one to the other like Fire's gliding or Benny with his charged jump ability. And unlike Fire, who is able to tap into all the playable clans, Benny and Isabella only have access to their clan's powers and powers that match their clan's affinities, which is a nice touch. And unique to them are also their own weapons, where Benny gets a modified pistol that fires like an SMG, and Isabella uses a rapier by default for her melee attacks. But apart from that, overall, these DLCs have more downsides to them than positives, and it's just upsetting to see. If there was something I could suggest, it would be for the story where instead of showing what happens up until their respective boss fights, we get to see them before the events of Bloodlines 2. Some of the more interesting parts of the DLCs have been the flashback sections. For Benny, it was finding out about how he came to join the Sabbat, since it gave him more context as to why he did what he did. And as for Isabella, it was learning about her own backstory and who she was as a person, and I believe capitalizing on those parts of their story to build on their motivations and desires would have been far more interesting than asking the question, what was Isabella even doing when you were looking for collectibles around Seattle? However, the most egregious thing about these is that each DLC is worth like $15, and these are not worth that price tag. I'm sorry, but $15 for 3 hours of story? These are not worth going through at all. I can only really suggest, not even recommend, but suggest others play this if you're really into Bloodlines 2, or you got these with the expansion pass and just want that tiny extra bit of story. Fucking expansion pass barely counts as an expansion. But that's about it when it comes to these two story DLCs for Bloodlines 2. I expected a bit more from these, and what I got was probably the first time I felt actual disappointment from the game itself, rather than just being upset with the development news and just lowering my expectations completely. All I can really do now is accept it and move on. Nothing is gonna change this. There'll be other vampire games out there that'll be more worth my time, and definitely more Vampire the Masquerade games as well. I don't have a quip to end this video with.